There's a vast difference between the public and the fandom when talking about opinions on film franchises. Public opinion often suggests arbitrary trends, like the even-numbered films within a series are the only good ones, that all films after a certain point are garbage, or that after a key person left, the series has never been quite as good. However, opinions within fandoms are generally more nuanced. Especially with James Bond, every film, character, or aspect is defended by someone somewhere as being the best of the series. Growing up, I always thought that Timothy Dalton was underrated, given that a lot of public retrospectives and documentaries and interviews that I had seen with casual fans were quite dismissive of his tenure. But upon entering the Bond fan community, I quickly learned that this was not the case. I still think the public are too quick to dismiss his two films, but I'm glad Bond fans are more considerate about what Dalton tried to bring to the series, and even if he's not your favorite, I'd be surprised if the most cynical fan couldn't get something out of the two efforts. With Roger Moore now firmly out of the picture after 1985, the search began in earnest for a new James Bond. You would think since the filmmakers had been anticipating Roger's retirement for some time that this process would have gone smoothly, but nothing could be further from the truth. Various names were suggested and some tested. The favorite seemed to be Sam Neill for a while, but the holdout was Cubby. The crew's eyes then turned to Pierce Brosnan, who was just finishing up Remington Steele and who had been on their minds since he came to visit the set of For Your Eyes Only. Pierce was tested and met with enthusiastic approval by all. Trying to capitalize on the announcement of the new 007, NBC reversed their cancellation decision of Remington Steele at the last minute, and thus Pierce was no longer available. This delayed the production of the film long enough that Timothy Dalton, longtime contender for the part, suddenly became available, and on such short notice, he agreed to become the fourth James Bond. With Timothy now in place, filming began immediately on The Living Daylights, just in time to celebrate the series' 25th anniversary. James Bond survives a training exercise on Gibraltar where an enemy kills another 00 agent and leaves behind a message saying "Smirt spionum," death to spies. Sometime later, a Russian general named Koskov reaches out to the British about defecting and expressly asks for 007 to protect him while out in the open. During the night of the defection, Bond instinctively shoots the other sniper's gun instead of her, deducing that she could not have been a professional KGB agent as was reported. Once over to their side, Koskov explains that Smirt spionum is a secret operation meant to eliminate foreign spies and put in motion by General Pushkin, the head of the Soviet intelligence. Soon afterwards, Koskov is kidnapped from the British safe house he is being held at. In retaliation and thinking that the Russians were responsible, M orders Bond to assassinate Pushkin. Sensing that something is off about this whole plot, Bond goes off on his own to track down the woman sniper and must piece together the clues he has to deduce which Russian general he should be targeting before the security of the West is compromised. The Living Daylights marks a return to the more grounded Ian Fleming-inspired stories. Beyond adapting the titular tale and the idea of Smersh, there's such an air of Fleming about this one. The short story, one of my favorites by the way, is an examination of Bond's reluctance to kill without reason, which has been mentioned a few times in the books before, like in the beginning of the Goldfinger novel. This film has some of that subtext, but it also demonstrates both the positive and negative consequences of Bond's instincts. For example, at the beginning, his instincts lead him to sparing Kara's life, which enables him to uncover the truth behind Koskov's defection. That same gut feeling has him holding back from killing Pushkin right away, which ultimately leads to a positive outcome. However, Bond's choice to operate under the radar for the first part has him calling in a favor from Saunders, which indirectly leads to his death at the fair. And Bond's rash dash to find the assassin afterwards also plants the seed of doubt within Kara about who Bond is, and thus leads him to being captured later. The film overall feels much smarter than other recent entries in considering the actions of Bond as a character within the story and how that helps the film to progress in its tale. Bond in this outing is still a glorified action hero, but one that is a bit more relatable and doesn't automatically win a battle because his name is the biggest one on the poster. This is a refreshing way to go after the party days of Moore, and helps to endear this film to a more modern audience. Bond is a flawed character, one with some traction on his soul and a sense of world weariness. He doesn't enjoy the dirtier elements of his job, but his sense of duty and willpower gets him through the long nights. In a way, I feel like this film is more what Sean Connery wanted to do with Never Say Never Again. He was just a bit too early in his desire, and his production screwed him over on that goal. But we finally did start to get around to something like that later. I don't think there was ever such a stark tonal contrast between two actors than with Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton. Perhaps it was creative fatigue with Roger's style of films, or perhaps it was simply diminishing returns. Whatever the reason, the Eon team were eager to try something different, and now unburdened with the expectations that came with an established actor, you would think the team would feel as free as a bird. However, that's not exactly the story I'm seeing unfold on screen. Because Dalton came on to the project so late, the writers had to write the story and character fairly in the middle in terms of tone, and the finished film still has some leftover Moore-style elements. The opening sequence in particular is a good example of this. It seems to be a training exercise with a grim atmosphere, what with a killer stalking double O's. But there are still light-hearted touches like animals and pedestrians, confused soldiers, bored women on yachts. Honestly, you could have written this to have been in front of either of the last two adventures, substituting Timothy with Roger, and I don't think most people would notice the difference. Yet the film works in these bits better than you might expect, and they don't come off as egregious as the gondola through St. Mark's Square or a drunk doing an exaggerated double take. I think this was thanks to the filmmakers' willingness to adapt the film to the actor while in production. As filming progressed, rewrites could be done, and Dalton's sensibilities could color the project, thus allowing for that dramatic shift the filmmakers were looking to accomplish. There's a famous deleted scene where Bond rides a carpet down some wires, making it look like a magic carpet. I get the sense that there may have been more things like this in the original script, but I applaud the filmmakers for being willing to kill their darlings this time, letting the film and actor speak for themselves as to what the tone should be. As such, I'm amazed that Timothy Dalton does as well as he does given the circumstances. Not only did he not have much time to prepare, but he was very nervous on set. He wasn't used to this kind of publicity, and he wasn't sure if the crew being serious about doing a new kind of Bond film. Thankfully, the crew were serious, and Dalton grew into the part. I've always been very vocal about my love for the man, and that comes from a few sources. First, he cares a lot about the characters he plays, and when he can, he does a lot of careful research. Dalton was well versed in the Ian Fleming books and was a big fan, thus his desire to make Bond more human, which leans right into what I enjoy most. Dalton makes this translation a beautiful thing to watch, though I think his best performance is yet to come. The second source for this love is that his duology is far more careful about its plot construction, purpose of characters, and its thematic bridges, like I talked about earlier. The Dalton films are very much classic Bond in a lot of ways, though they signal a transition of sorts. As a franchise, James Bond has had to adapt over the years in order to stay relevant, and while there are many fans who wish we would have stayed closer to what Goldfinger and Russia were doing, the fact of the matter is that if we kept doing those kinds of films and Bond had kept all the elements of Connery's performances, the franchise would have become outdated and there wouldn't be the large fan base now. Most of us came in through the Roger Moore or Pierce Brosnan or Daniel Craig eras, and these are the ones that help to ensure that the Bond series remains beloved and continues to churn out grand and exciting adventures today. Dalton's push towards films with teeth and a concentrated direction is part of this lineage, and I hope that his current reappraisal continues for a while. I'm not a huge fan of Maryam d'Abo's Cara Malovi, and I know that's probably my most unpopular opinion about the film. I think the choice to start the movie with the short story and then explore the sniper character further is an inspired one, but when I get to know Cara, she comes up wanting for me. She's far more realistic, isn't so woman's fantasy hear me roar kind of a thing that some of the other Bond women were, and I will admit that's a refreshing change of pace here. Plus, I'm a fan of films whose leading ladies have the central stories built around them. But Cara's emotional naivety and almost childlike approach to certain things does grate on me a bit. I'm glad she starts to take more charge by the end of the film, but it takes 90 minutes for us to get there, and that's a little too long for me. I also don't feel like she quite works with Dalton on a chemistry level. I'm not saying she needs to be spunky or anything, but I'm not sensing any kind of spark, nor do I feel an emotional connection between the two, letting them relate to each other. I'd probably be okay with that if the film wasn't trying to portray the relationship as more tender. Dalton and Dabo do their best to sell that angle, but I'm not convinced that's the angle that should have been done here. She's not awful, but she's never been a favorite of mine. The film has two central villains, and unfortunately I think this is another misstep. I like Euron Krabbe as General Koskov. He has a disarming charm that makes it hard to see him as a proper villain, which I love. It makes the knife twist harder when you discover his insincerity. Krabbe is a fine actor, having worked with Paul Verhoeven on a few films and doing a fine part in Harrison Ford's The Fugitive. And while he's not my favorite camp of villains, he's a delightful presence. I just wish the idea of him having some kind of affection with Bond was taken a little further, either by having Bond treat him as a friend to, or by letting Koskov experience some sort of serious consequence for treating Bond more fairly than he should. Brad Whitaker, unfortunately, doesn't work for me. Joe Don Baker is an odd choice for the role of a military-obsessed arms dealer, and maybe because he infrequently shows up during the runtime, he seems to be a smaller presence in the film's story. I like how Bond dispatches him, meeting Whitaker's superior weaponry with one of his idols crushing him. However, he seems to be less of a threat than he should be, and comes off a little too juvenile, like a kid with delusions of grandeur about his social status. In another film, I would probably like this more if we got to pay that off in some way. The villain got to show off how dangerous the mentality is by going out into the field and using that weaponry with an unstable mind. But as it stands, he's one of the lower points of the cast, and his presence takes away from Koskov, which unfortunately hurts the film's standing for me in the series. I never thought much of Necros, so you can imagine my surprise when I found him to be one of the bigger upsets from my Henchmen ranking video. He's an effective assassin, but I felt as though he wasn't strong enough to justify a higher ranking. Upon further examination, maybe I did him dirty. I love that our first glimpse of him is tossed off and that the audience likely wouldn't suspect a thing. But then we see him assume various disguises in order to infiltrate the safe house, and that's very impressive. There's an almost Red Grant quality to the man. The final fight with him on the back of the Hercules plane is breathtaking as well. But I feel like there's something missing from him to make him a true standout of the series. Maybe it's because he's deliberately designed to be unmemorable while in disguise that he escapes my thinking. But maybe that in of itself is quite the endorsement for an assassin. I don't know, maybe a one-on-one scene with him and Bond before the final fight would have helped. Either a dialogue scene or another fight where Necros escapes and Bond has to keep his guard up from now on. I don't know, something. As many of you probably know, this film was initially intended to have a larger role for General Gogol, but Walter Gotell's health prevented that from happening, so the part was rewritten for a new character, General Pushkin, played by John Rhys-Davies. I love Davies. I've seen him in many things, and I really like the character of Pushkin, but this would have been an excellent way to pay off Gogol's recurring presence in the series for the last decade. That said, Davies makes Pushkin seem more directly involved with operations than Gogol was, thus the mutual respect between him and Bond comes across better. Sure, Gogol was involved in plenty of operations before, but I don't think he was doing anything more than what M might have done, and I don't know if I could have seen Robert Brown deliberately faking his death in order to trick the villains. The scene between Pushkin and Bond in the hotel is my absolute favorite of the film. The dialogue is well written, each actor is carefully playing the other, and the tension is ramped up considerably. It feels so true to the spirit of the darker side of the Bond character that I could have happily watched a scene twice as long as this. It's one of my favorite scenes in any Bond film. Cameron Shaw continues this film's streak of good allies. Art Malik is another fine character actor that I've seen in a few things, and I like the combination of intelligence and battle-hardened sense that he brings to the role. Saunders is also a fine Bond ally. The rapport between Wheatley and Dalton really feels like it could only have come from two men in the same line of work. And Saunders' willingness to do Bond a covert favor endears him to me. His death is powerful, mostly because of the moments before and after. Bond's sincere gratitude to him, followed by the boiling rage at the man's death, is a great character moment. It actually helps to sell Bond's going rogue in License to Kill, as I've already seen a man visibly affected by a friend's death and how that led to an emotionally rash act. Speaking of Felix Leiter, the character weirdly ends his 14-year absence from the series in the form of John Terry. I'm not entirely sure why Leiter is here in this story, as I'm pretty confident they didn't know during the production of this film what the next one was going to do with the character, so reintroducing him to the series now feels arbitrary. He only really serves as a familiar face so as to ease Bond after the manhunt. His role either should have been expanded, maybe providing us with some critical piece of the puzzle we didn't know before now, or been cut out entirely. Lastly, we have the second actress to play Moneypenny in the official series, Caroline Bliss. Personally, I think she comes across a little too young for the part, and she only really gets a few scenes with Dalton here, doesn't meet him at all in the next film, so it's entirely understandable that we never got to see her full potential. But just based on this film, I'm comfortable with saying she's not a patch on most of the other actresses. After veering into more campy waters with the last two films, John Glenn returns to the sea of espionage for this outing, and that's a relief to me. Not that I minded some of the stuff in the other two, but Glenn made a mighty statement about his take on Bond in For Your Eyes Only, and I was anxious to get back to more of that. Daylight still has its lighthearted and more fantastic bits, but it really tones down their prominence in favor of a quieter atmosphere and intrigue. As such, Bond's world feels the most dangerous that it's been since the early days of Connery. The film trusts its audience to have the attention span to go 10 or 15 minutes without some action sequence, and we are well rewarded. There are still great bits of action, like the ice chase and the fight on the cargo net, but some of the quieter scenes are also some of the most memorable parts of the film. I've already talked about the hotel scene, but I also love the sniper sequence in Kara's arrest. However, the film starts to run a little long at times. The Felix Leiter reveal and the Mujahideen extension to the Hercules sequence are bits that could have been cut. The fight with Brad Whitaker is another sticking point for me, though unlike the other two, this actually covers a necessary story beat. I think maybe it's because it comes after a prolonged action sequence and we're led to believe that we've dealt with most everything in the film's story by this point. It could also be because Whitaker's role in the story is diminished in comparison to Koskov's, and so he feels like a minor threat. I probably would have accepted Whitaker being dealt with by Pushkin and his crew in a quick scene, much like the Russian treasurer in Octopussy. Though that does mean we would have sacrificed a second scene with Pushkin and Bond, along with an okay fight scene. I'm not exactly sure how to fix this, but it's definitely a problem I feel while watching the film. Like the other 80s Bond films, Daylights is keenly aware of its position within the waning days of the Cold War. The period of détente and the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union colors this film in key ways. Cubby continues his mantra of not painting all the Russians as bad guys, and there's healthy skepticism about Bond and M over Koskov's claims of a mad Russian general. There's also Pushkin's reasonable choice to fake his own death so that he and Bond can uncover Koskov's plan. There's Bond's working with Rosika. It helps the audience to feel like they're watching real people who might respond as real people. And it helps the film immensely in demonstrating that Bond can work well both within the exaggerated spy fantasy and the restrained espionage thriller camps. The one aspect I'm iffy about is the Mujahideen. I don't think it's fair to criticize the film for including them, as they were a current world topic at the time, and the Bond filmmakers always start by looking at what's in the headlines, whether it be tackling the drug trade in License to Kill, the fall of the Soviet Union in GoldenEye, the media barons in Tomorrow Never Dies, and so on. Plus, you can't expect the filmmakers to have possessed the foresight to know what would happen to the organized Afghan resistance after the removal of Soviet troops from the region, which was formally announced the same month the film was released in the US, by the way. But I'm not gonna lie, watching this film in a post-9/11 world and knowing how a lot of modern terrorist groups were born out of the struggle, and this organization in particular, it makes me feel a little uncomfortable initially. The best I can do is compartmentalize and just enjoy the film as is, which isn't too hard to do, quite frankly. Part of this could be because we have what is, for my money, the best John Barry score in the series. I've raved about this soundtrack a few times, but it bears repeating. It's my favorite score in the series because there's never a dull moment. Barry has themes and motifs that interweave throughout, and he makes the connecting tissue interesting. Favorite tracks of mine include The Ice Chase, The Sniper Was a Woman, Approaching Kara, Mujahideen and Opium, and Hercules Takes Off. The Aha song is a fine Bond tune, following on from Duran Duran's effort for the last film, and it flourishes under Barry's traditional approach of using it both in action and ambiance. The Pretenders offer two songs that work beautifully within the score, Where Has Everybody Gone and If There Was a Man, the former serving as Necros' theme and the latter as the romantic underscore. But it's the iteration of the James Bond theme that is my highlight. It's funny because it really is just the orchestral version that Barry did during the Moore films, but with the added bass and synth hits, it makes a world of a difference. It's one of my favorite versions of the James Bond theme. A couple of minor things to close us out. First, I think it's interesting that both Dalton films have Bond operating outside of the service for a bit. Bond's trip to track down Kara and going to Vienna are meant to be under the radar from M. And then, of course, the entirety of License to Kill has Bond operate on his own. I think that's an interesting coincidence. I also have a question about a bit that's always bugged me. After the cargo net fight with Necros, Bond and Kara are suddenly over the Mujahideen escaping the Russian forces. After Bond took off on the runway from the airbase, he told Kara to keep the controls straight and steady. And then we had the fight with Necros, which went on for a bit. So how in the world are they by Kamran Shah and his army while they are escaping on horses from the Russians? The Living Daylights offers a classic Bond adventure with an exhilarating edge to it. I first saw this movie after watching License to Kill, so it was weird to see Dalton tackle something more standard, but I've come around on it quite a bit. It's a great ride. The few issues I mentioned are the things that are holding it back from my personal top 10 of the series, but it's so close a lot of the time. It's also great to see that other films haven't completely forgotten about this one, as elements of it show back up in later Bond adventures, most notably No Time to Die. Dalton makes a bold debut here, and while his reputation seems more based on his work in the next film, he comes in with a declaration of his own about how to tackle Bond as a franchise, and the filmmakers seem to be sustaining his vision wholeheartedly throughout the film. This is one of my most viewed entries in the series, as it ticks off a lot of what I love about Bond films, and I'm always happy to pop it in, even if there are other installments I prefer. At the time, it fared better at the box office than any of the series since For Your Eyes Only, and audiences seemed to be optimistic about what Dalton had to offer, so it seemed like Eon had started laying the foundation for another successful run. However, the next film would test that warm reception and would feature the boldest take on a Bond film yet.